All right. Welcome, everybody. It is 7 o'clock. It's good to see everybody this evening. We are going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 15. I think all my kids have aged out of that, but you never can tell. That doesn't sound like them. So as you can see on the slide here, the final nail, we're going to be talking about the last rejection of Saul. Covered the first one a couple chapters ago, but this one, obviously, as the title suggests, this is going to be it for him. He's not going to die, but as far as him being the chosen one of God to lead Israel, this more or less is when his reign comes to an effective end. So that's going to be the topic of this evening, and then his successor, we'll probably get into chapter 16 as well. But as we do every time, we will start with a word of prayers. So if you guys would bow your heads with me, please, we'll say a prayer. Father God in heaven, we are grateful for the safety and comfort we have this evening in this place where we gather together to worship you. Keep us humble. Let us learn from this lesson tonight, especially of one who acts and looks religious, but his heart, of course, is disobedient and in the wrong place. Let us never mimic him. Let us always, the next servant you have in the next chapter, let us resemble his faithfulness towards you so much more. Be with us in this room. Let us grow in our faith and our love and our devotion to you. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, so the final nail. So if you remember where we ended up from chapter 14, a lot went on in chapter 14. We went through it. I went through it. You listened to it super quickly because it was a humongous chapter. But essentially, if you rip chapter 14 out of the rest of the narrative, things seem to be going fairly well for Saul. He had that weird kind of interaction with his son. Don't really know exactly what's going on there with Jonathan breaking the oath. We are introduced to Jonathan. But in the end of chapter 14, Saul's doing great stuff. It even says he fought bravely in verse 48 of chapter 14, and this is significant for who we're fighting tonight. He fought bravely, striking down the Amalekites and delivering Israel from the hands of its enemy. And so it's one of those times, if you're reading the Bible, you're like, I wish the story stopped here because then I could just feel good about everything going forward. But of course, Saul has a few more pages in this book and things don't end well for him. And so with those Amalekites, we're going to pick up here in chapter 15. So chapter 15, I will start at verse 1. This is a very familiar story to most of us. Probably the most familiar Saul story, but we're still going to go through it and pick some things out as we go. So, chapter 15, verse 1. Then Samuel said to Saul, I was the one the Lord sent to anoint you as king over his people Israel. Now listen to what the Lord says. Here is what the Lord of heaven's armies has said. I carefully observed how the Amalekites opposed Israel along the way when Israel came up from Egypt. So go now, strike down the Amalekites. Destroy everything they have, don't spare them. Put them to death, man, woman, child, infant, ox, sheep, camel, and donkey alike. So Saul assembled the army and mustered them at Telaim. There were 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. Saul proceeded to the city of Amalek, where he set an ambush in the wadi. And so he said to the Kenites, Go on, leave. Go down from among the Amalekites, otherwise I will sweep you away with them. After all, you were kind to all the Israelites when they came up from Egypt. And so the Kenites withdrew from among the Amalekites. Then Saul struck down the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, which is next to Egypt. He captured King Agag and the Amalekites alive, but he executed all Agag's people with the sword. However, Saul and the army spared Agag along with the best of the flock, the cattle, the fatlings, and the lambs, as well as everything else that was of value. They were not willing to slaughter them, but they did slaughter everything that was despised and worthless. All right, so we'll stop there right now and pick out a few things before we go further. So Saul has kind of been struggling up to this point. I think we're pretty familiar with kind of his character flaws. He hasn't been fantastic, but he hasn't really done anything just catastrophic yet. Yes, he had the not waiting for Samuel portion of the sacrifice that we read about earlier, but even then, it's kind of in between the lines because God said he wouldn't have a dynasty, but he still didn't say, hey, Saul, you're out. And so this is going to be a big change from what we've seen so far and kind of his shortcomings. So there's really no room for a lot of interpretation with this command. And we're going to talk about the command in a little bit more detail in a second. But it's pretty straightforward. With Samuel's command to wait for him, if you remember when we analyzed that one a little deeper, there's a little bit of ambiguity between what Samuel meant, what he was talking about, who was allowed to do what. There was almost, if you really wanted to squint hard, like, oh yeah, Saul may have the right to do what he did. We know he didn't. This one, though, you don't have that. This one's pretty straightforward. So there's the command. The reference to the Amalekites is the famous battle in Exodus 17. You guys remember which famous battle that was? Probably the most famous battle Moses was in. Yeah, it's the one where his arms were held up, they win. If his arms fell down, they were losing. That's the battle he's referencing right there. And so that was the Amalekites from Exodus when he was harassing the people of Israel. They don't stop there, though. It's important to note it because if you think about the history, that may have been, 400-ish years ago? It's not like the Amalekites were just sitting down, minding their own business the entire time, and guys like, oh yeah, I forgot. They offended me way back then, and they've been great since then, but since they had great-grandparents that did something wrong, well, I'm going to get them now. No. Throughout the book of Judges, they show up over and over again, and they're continuing to do what they did in the Exodus. So it's not like they've just been hanging out down there. And even right here, we see that they're fighting with Saul just a couple verses earlier in chapter 14. So this total destruction thing is the Hebrew word. I don't put all the little accent marks on them. It's Hiram. I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. I was talking about it today at work with guys who do. But anyway, what's going on with that is you can see in my little bullet points, it is complete dedication to God. And so whatever that has been decreed, doesn't matter what it is, and the command is pretty clear, this doesn't belong to any of you. One of the reasons people go to war, and one of the reasons the common soldier is motivated to go to war, it's not because of some sort of nationalistic pride. There's a little bit of that. It's not because you love your king so much. There's a little bit of that. It's because if you win, everything they have lying around can become yours. And so as a soldier, a peasant, someone who doesn't have a whole lot, that is a very fast way to get very wealthy in a snap. If you win, of course. There's risk involved in going to battle and the savvy stuff. But they usually kind of looked at each other like, we could probably do that. Anyway, that's been eliminated from this fight. You, common soldier, you don't get to do that in this fight. You, king of mine, tell your common soldiers you don't get to do that in this fight either. So your motivation cannot be for self-gain. And so it's very, very different than a lot of the other battles. And so you can see, again, complete ban of the spoils for the people. Same ideas going on there. So that's what's going on with that. And so one thing I want to ask you guys then, and then we'll talk about this, because there are three different difficult parts of the text. Saul has all sorts of difficult points of the text. This is one of them. What exactly is going on with this directive? Because if you notice, as you read verse 3, is where we get the command. Who gets included in that? Is it just guilty people? Children, and go as a step further, the infants. It's not like the toddlers or whatever. There's no way any one of those infants had anything to do or could have anything ever to do with any of the wrongs any of the Amalekites ever had against the Israelites. So how do we square that hole, round that peg, whatever the phrase is for that one? So what do we make of that? I'm not being rhetorical right now. What do you guys think about that? So we have barbaric. What else?
Well, I think everybody's thinking it. Just don't say it. The Lord said to do this.
All right, yeah.
And there's a point where we don't know the mind of God or the future or what He holds for those young infants and children.
All right.
In their future life, because we know we don't end life when our body dies.
All right, yeah.
That's what I think.
Does anybody else have anything else?
Well, I think God just obviously wanted that line to be wiped out. So
All right.
He didn't want any more descendants or want them to be a problem for the Israelites at all anymore.
Okay. Anybody have anything else? Start fresh. Well, not in this case. Not in this case. All right, so thanks for participating. It's a hard question because obviously, especially in today's culture, especially among groups like us, the killing of infants, it has a very bad taste in our mouth. And we don't want to worship a God that goes around slaughtering babies. Like, that should make all of us uncomfortable. A question like, all right, what's going on here? And so there are other instances of this concept in the Bible. This is not the only place this shows up. Surprise, surprise. Many of the things we've talked about this quarter already have shown up in different shades and different sort of varieties, I guess, in earlier parts of Scripture. Deuteronomy 20:17. This is one of the most prominent places it shows up first. You have all these nations that are listed when it's talking about who you're going to go wipe out in the land of Canaan, essentially. And so it's like, hey, go wipe them all out, get them out of here. Their time for judgment has come. So there's a lot of backstory going on with a lot of these that's just not shared with us in the Bible. God promised the Israelites Canaan, yes. But also, the Canaanites who were in that land, they were also being judged as well. It wasn't just, well, because I promised my people this a long time ago, you all have to die now. No, they were doing terrible stuff leading up to that as well. Joshua 6-8 is the most kind of detailed versions we get of this first after the commands up there in Deuteronomy. This is Jericho and Ai, however you pronounce that one. They are completely wiped out with some very, very notable exceptions. And Jericho, who's the famous exceptions? Rahab and her whole family. And it actually does not give a number for that. When I went back and read this, it wasn't just her husband, and a couple of her kids. She seemed to cram a lot of people in that house. And they were living with the Israelites until the day that was written outside the camp, is what the text said. So they were all there. And so there was an exception carved out there. The AI one, do you guys have any idea off the top here? This is more random because there's no Rahab story in that story. But what were the exceptions in that one? I can't quote it exactly. I went and reread it today as well. Does anybody have an idea of what the who or what?
Exceptions to what?
The AI one. They destroyed them as well, like Jericho, but it wasn't all of it either.
Well, Achan stole some stuff.
Yeah, there were things, well, he may have been inappropriate, but there are other things when it talks about like the ox, the camel, the sheep, and everything like that. That was kind of excluded from the AI version of this. And so don't quote me on that one. I forget exactly, but there were not people that were allowed to live. It was other stuff. So it happened then. In Joshua 10:28-40, you go and read, there's a big list of nations that he defeated. And one thing about those nations is if you go and read some of our stories now, and especially one famous one with David that's going to happen pretty shortly, is if that happened to all those nations, then who and what are we reading about in Judges and Kings of people coming from those nations that allegedly happened to that are all still very much alive? And so this idea of completely wiping them out was accomplished and was recorded, but then you get a few chapters later in your Bible and all of a sudden these people that were completely wiped out are still very much there. And you're scratching your heads like, okay, what's going on with this phrase? What are they doing here? How does that work? Jabesh Gilead. This was a famous city that we talked about not too long ago. In Judges 21:10, this one wasn't a God-commanded one, but the people used the same phrasing, saying, hey, we're going to wipe all of them out. And then we find a little bit later with Nahash, not too long after that, because Jabesh Gilead happens at the end of the whole Judges thing, the city has been completely repopulated and so large, this giant army that's going around slaughtering everybody has to set up a siege around it because they can't just wipe it out and walk over it. And so again, you're thinking like, well, if they're supposed to do this whole destroy everything thing, we see it not too long later and it's clearly still very much there. And so again, the phrasing, what this is actually going on, lets us kind of scratch our head a bit. 1 Samuel 22, we'll get to there in just a little bit. Saul does the very same thing, uses the same term when he wants to wipe out the priest of Nob. You guys remember why he wants to kill all of those guys? What'd they do? Yeah, they helped David. It's all they like that. And so he went in there, and one of them survives. David says, hey, I'll protect you. I don't know how much that guy believed that because he's like, well, we just helped you, and my entire family's now dead. But he stayed with David, and things ended out well for him. And so we have different examples of this in the Bible. This is not an exhaustive list. There are other ones you can find. But in all of them, what exactly the outcome is, it varies. There is never a set, this was the command, and this is how it was carried out, and it's the exact same way every time. There's always variance in what actually happens at the end of these. Sometimes it's written in an explicit. Other times you read a little bit later on, you're like, oh, wait a second. If they were supposed to do it like this, then how is this here? It's like, you have the flood happen and everybody dies except for Noah and his family, and then Noah comes out of the ark and there's a city he goes and visits. And it's like, wait a second, I thought everything just got wiped out. That's not how that happened, but that'd be kind of the same thing that's going on with this. So, one thing or one way we can interpret this is it doesn't always mean exactly what it says it means. That's an option. I mean, it's a translation and our interpretations. You pretty much always have to be willing to take that approach with anything you get to in the Bible because, again, we're reading this. There is some self-interpretation going on. Hey, we can get things wrong. So Joshua 12, I mentioned that one already, the list of conquered kings and places, that if they were completely gone, and Joshua, does anybody think Joshua is unfaithful servant of God? Absolutely not. You can't read the book of Joshua and think Joshua didn't do things properly. It's kind of one of his big character traits right there. Literally, God saves, God delivers is his name. But then you find a lot of those people later on. We already talked about those. Jabesh Gilead, yep, talked about that one. This is this one right here. 2 Samuel 1 is not very many chapters and or years away from where we are right now. And if Saul wiped out all of the Amalekites except for King Agag, how does David then run into an entire nation of Amalekites, which he has to deal with as well? And so the text didn't say Saul left everybody and a whole band of them over there he just completely ignored. No, it said he wiped them all out except for the one guy, except for clearly that's not what happened. And Hezekiah ultimately is the one that finally finished these guys off. I don't know how many hundreds of years later that is with the chronology. It's a long time away. Hezekiah is the one who finally actually completely ends the Amalekites, generations later. And so, all right, got to think about that. So another approach is it's out of line with our biblical worldview. And what I mean by that is kind of what you're getting at is maybe it is completely okay to slaughter infants when there's justifiable reason to do that. I don't know if I would have said before class, if you guys knew we were talking about this, hey, there's justifiable reasons to slaughter infants. And I'm like, everyone, what are you talking about? Again, I'm interpreting the Bible. I'm reading a translation of other people who had to make their own interpretive choices as well. And maybe the way I'm reading it is wrong and I'm reading into it. And I'm having problems with this passage because of me, not because of the passage itself. So that can happen with pretty much any verse in the Bible, but we'll just stick to the whole infant thing with this one. Third, it does seem completely out of line with God's character. But at the same time, I may be just interpreting God's character incorrectly as well. And so some of those references I have there, so we don't go to the New Testament all that often in this class, just because there are lots of foreshadowings of Christ throughout all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, but I intentionally just try to keep it in the Old Testament. So we'll break the fourth wall or whatever, go into the New Testament just a little bit. But Romans 6:23, for the payoff of sin is death, but the gift of God's eternal life. And so again, if the payoff of sin is death, how are the babies being thrown into all that? 2 Corinthians, what I got on there, 5 verse 10. In no way did I, we got this, I have the wrong reference there. It must be, oh no, lost my slides. There it goes. Nope, come back. Okay, 2 Corinthians, not 1 Corinthians. So, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be paid back according to what he has done while in the body, whether good or evil. That one may be a little more comforting to us because in this case, being paid back for what evil they've done, well, they haven't done any evil, and so they wouldn't have to be paid back for that. So there is that option as well. So before I ask you guys, and we'll talk about this a little bit more before moving on, last one on this one. This is something that existed in other ancient Near Eastern cultures as well. This whole idea of holy war, holy concentration, the ban, whatever. Israel was not the only society that participated in that. That was kind of a generic cultural thing that was going on at the time. That's just going to keep going up. And whatever it was, I'll finish with these two and then I'll open it back up again. They all seem to understand exactly what it was. There are different things we've kind of already hit in here where we don't fully understand, like the Spirit of the Lord rushing onto somebody. we don't really know exactly what that is or how to define it or how they knew, but they all seem to know exactly what that was. And so it's not really laid out for us. We covered the Urim and the Thummim thing, whatever, the little lot stick has. We have no idea how those work. We have no idea what they look like. We have no idea anything about it, but they all knew exactly how that worked, because when they got to Ezra's time, somebody did it and they're like, oh yeah, this is how this works, but we have no idea. And so I would just say a strict literal reading is probably unadvisable because of all the evidence we have of when they carried this out, but then those people were still very, very much alive later on, because there's multiple examples of that. And so just based on that, it's like, okay, it could be a have no mercy kind of thing during the battle, but when the battle's over, we won, we conquered him, we go home, but we don't take any plunder this time. It could be if they run off, don't chase them. Let them go. We killed who was here, but we're still not taking any plunder or whatever. We just don't know, because there were clearly survivors, it seems more often than not, even though they said they accomplished it sometimes as well. So that's the end of my spiel on that. What do you guys think or have to say? Yeah.
Just an additional quick thing on that point is like the description in verse 7 where it says Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. So it's like in that geographical area he's executing on it.
So,
there could be other encampments or whatever, maybe.
So that's a similar phrasing when they say like from Dan to Beersheba.
Yeah.
It's kind of a idiom or whatever for like totality.
Oh.
And so it could mean, like, I don't know, because if I say Israelites from Dan to Beersheba, I don't mean as straight as the crow flies. It's kind of like all of Israel.
Right.
It's similar to what's going on with that, because that encompassed that range, kind of the northern and southern, southwestern bounds of their territory, is what seems to be going on with that. But back to the strict literal reading thing I just said, we don't really know where those places are, what those mean either. And so it could be that
even
his
the
swath
phrasing
of
it,
destruction.
if we were like, they killed all the Americans from Florida to Washington. That, like, it could be that broad thing, but it could also be then there could be others living abroad that just, even though you did it.
Because Saul's not magical, regardless of his foil. He's not magical.
Yeah.
Was there a hand over here first, and then we'll get over there.
I mean, I think the one context we have, this is an argument that obviously atheists like to make, just because of the fact of the matter of when bad things happen to children, God must not care, that kind of thing. But I will say, if you look at Genesis 15, I think that's where I would start with this, just mainly the fact that God lays out the situation with the whole, when he sets up his situation with Abraham, he makes a covenant. He says, listen, the Amorites' sins are not full, but in 400 years they will be full.
Yeah.
And at that time, I'm going to do swift judgment. Now, obviously, we see the incompleteness of that judgment that throughout Judges, throughout Samuel, throughout that, where the Israelites did not fully do exactly what they said, even though they might have, in this case, for this group of people, they were attacking them when they were leaving before the hands were up. These folks were attacking the rear, the weak people, and that's the reason why God said he was going to judge them so harshly. But the thing that I guess we don't really understand fully is that nations do fall and time happens. There might be a time where the United States loses many kids because God's judgment might come full to us at some point, and I hope that is not the case. But I could see that happening, and that's the challenges of this internal picture. I do think that most of the time when children are killed, they're not. There is a benefit of having consequences versus of the forefathers per se versus what they have done, and I do think God is just, and those kids were probably in a better situation because of that, even though it might sound cruel to us to some extent, that I think that we have to keep in mind. But that's something that I would stress. It is always hard to understand that some of these things, like for example, we do these kind of things all the time. Like we act like slavery only happened in the 1700s of America, when it's been a horrendous problem forever, and there's a lot of issues that go. I'm just saying that we generalize things from our context, when in reality this is a large 6,000 year plus situation that has happened, that is hard to understand. But generally speaking, I do think that it's when Israel fails is why we see these groups of people rise up, like the Jebusites, right? I mean, they don't even have Jerusalem yet. We wiped
Right.
them out in Judges, and then they're back in the
Yeah.
city. And David finally, smartly, makes that the capital city when the Benjamites and the Judah kind of were at odds with one another. They went to a neutral location that was on their border. And I mean, it's all smart politics, but those people got back in there. And so it's hard. The challenge is that we don't really have all the days. I mean, that's one thing I think we can't really argue too. Like, for example, what do we have? 100 of David's days?
Well, that's when I
recorded?
started the class, like,
Yeah.
as much of a history as this is, it's not actually a very good history because of that right there, is we have so little of it.
So we have to. We got the highlights. We know that God works all things in His time, and we know that things don't always happen. The goal of this is to get to the New Testament, right? The challenge is the lack of Israel that is so apparent is that you can be born a Jew and be a terrible Jew. Right? I mean, you don't have to be following God's commands if it's not in your heart. When we get to the New Testament, He fixed that, and that's what I think we have to keep in the big picture.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
I mean, in terms of literal reading, yeah, I mean, literal in the sense of, was every single Amalekite person killed? Well, it doesn't seem like that because we see an Amalekite later scattered around. However, I think probably the nation itself was unalterably changed.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
After this event, it's not as many of them, and it's different, So literal, maybe not in that sense, in terms of 100% of the people, but there is a literal judgment here.
Oh yeah, you can't avoid
And
that.
that happens over and over in the Old Testament, and I think that's always a challenge for us. Is it just makes us uncomfortable. And as long as we don't take a literal reading because we find Amalekites later, and not just because this makes me uncomfortable, therefore I'm going to not read it literally.
Right.
That's not the motivation we want to use.
No, I think it's because the evidence that is in the text.
Yeah, right. So, but God's judgment, like He said in Genesis 15, He said He was going to come back, and when their iniquity was full. Another aspect with all of these tribes is they were worshiping idols. Their worship was sex in their religion of all kinds. They were killing their babies and doing all kinds of things, incest and all. Like, the society was very corrupt and very debauched. And eventually God says, for all of those things, including now, there's a time when I cut it off. I mean, you look at the Roman Empire, I think that's God's judgment in more modern times, where they were so corrupt. We know about their history and what they ended up with and their dictatorships and all the corrupt things they were doing. And eventually God says, that's it. And in those situations, kids are collateral. And it was for the Israelites too. When the Assyrians came and when the Babylonians came, there were kids. Some of the mothers ate their kids during that process.
Yeah.
I mean, it was awful. So those judgments are real, and we can, and like, yes, atheists use that as an argument to malign God's character. And ultimately, that's the question: do I trust God to be just in all these situations, even when I don't understand? I think that's what it gets
So
down
we're
to.
probably not going to get to it tonight, but there is an aspect of God's character that we are, and we'll get, it's in another slide that'll kind of come up to where we're kind of, a lot of us, even among Christians, we kind of turn a blind eye to it because it's a side of His character we don't really like. But we may get to that tonight or not. Matt was first, and Meg.
The Genesis 15 piece is really interesting, and I think the Bible doesn't give us a large glimpse into this, but in order for there to be a judgment, there has to be a standard. So these people had to know some sort of standard, and in my opinion, there had to be some opportunity for them to make themselves right with God, even though they weren't Jews. Otherwise, there's not really what are you judging based on? And what does it mean that it's not complete? Why would He be waiting for this completion if there wasn't a chance of them to do right?
It's just
Right.
something we can only speculate on those
Yeah,
because
that's
it doesn't. Yeah.
speculation. But the other piece is God's nature that you referenced. I think a lot of times we think of it, His nature changed in the New Testament. But look at Sodom and Gomorrah, for example. God was looking for an opportunity. He's reasoning with Abraham, and Abraham says, if I can find 50, and he goes down to 5 people. If he could have just found 5 people that were serving God, God said, I will spare the city. And I think that has always been God's nature, not just in the New Testament, it was throughout history.
I mean, we would
Well,
face
Nate.
challenges.
Nathan.
Just go ahead.
All right.
Go ahead.
Wait.
I was just gonna also say, like, I agree that it makes us very uncomfortable to think about, like, the slaughter of infants, the slaughter of children in this circumstance.
Well, interesting phrase there, because who are the other individuals in the Bible that killed babies?
Pharaoh.
And then who else did it? I heard Herod, and who's the other famous one? Pharaoh. And so it's another, just the phrasing you use there is another thing that makes our heads like, wait a second. The bad people in the Bible were the ones doing this. So what's going on here? But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so, but then when we look at God and kind of his position over mankind, he has given life to all, and at some point life will end. And so in the broader picture of things, like him commanding people to go into battle and utterly destroy them, it's not an actual end of life if we truly like look at how God views us all. Like, because of the eternal like living of our souls. And so when God commands it, it's not as drastic of a finality. It's not an evil thing that we would then cast upon God that he has done, but it would be evil for us to do, because then we are taking like the place of God. Like we are enacting our own judgment over who deserves to live and who deserves to die. And so, but for him, it's like life isn't ending for these people.
So I'm going to push back on that one a little bit, just because of where we are in the Bible, and again, with what it gives and doesn't give us. The idea of an afterlife as we have it, I have no idea if they knew about it or not yet, because it has not come up at all. No, that's what I'm saying. And so for him to fulfill this order, one of the things they thought about with afterlife and living on, your descendants mattered a whole lot for you to keep continuing on. And so one thing that is going on here is killing the infants, the babies. That's not just some sort of tragic, terrible thing that, okay, you shouldn't kill the babies. It's he's shutting them out of the afterlife, more or less, which is kind of the more severe thing that they would interpret that as. It's just, we don't have time to talk about what they thought of the afterlife or not in the Old Testament. It's another class. But there's a little bit of that going on. And so I'm going to give you one more chance, but then I want to talk about the Kenites real fast, because they're a fun group.
Well, something Matt said, I wanted to piggyback on that, just the idea of the nations having some kind of standard, because we get inklings of that through the scripture. Even in Genesis with Abraham and Abimelech and the Pharaoh, when they take Sarah and then they find out, oh, that's your wife, they know instinctively
There was
that's
some
wrong.
sort of shared...
Yeah, they know it's wrong to take another man's wife. And we have a lot of instinctive morality built in us, because I believe we're made in God's image. It's an evidence even for his existence, I think. But there were, and then the prophet, he sent prophets to Nineveh and some of the other places to say repent. And sometimes they did.
Yeah, we don't know what efforts have been made for those Amalekites. Like, because we have no idea how many prophets, as you mentioned, like who have been going there. They've been going there for years, and they just keep no. And so we just get this little glimpse right here that the final aspect of it, when there could be all sorts of history we don't even know, because this gentleman over here, so I forget your name is, we just get small snippets of what's going on. But yeah. All right, great comments. We can talk about this more in the next class if you want. I just want to move on a little bit since we're running a little out of time today. So the battle isn't too, it's impressive, whatever, but there's not too much to talk about it. One notable absence I want to point out is the Spirit of the Lord does not rush on Saul. It has happened a couple times prior, but it doesn't happen now. And so that's something as you're reading about a big deliverance coming, you're like, all right, where's that Spirit of, it's not here. Saul's going to have some interactions with the Spirit of the Lord later on. Is not the same thing, though. And so it's a notable absence right there. So here are the Kenites. I wanted to talk about them real fast because all these interesting little groups that pop up and go away through the Bible fascinate me more than they should. But who these guys are, they are Midianites through Moses' father-in-law. And so you read about them and his father-in-law in Judges right there. They, unlike the Amalekites, lived in the same region. And also, unlike the other Midianites, who Israel's had some bad dealings with the Midianites in the past as well, they didn't seem to be part of that group either. They're part of the Midianites, but their own little tribe within them. They were very supportive of Israel's travels. They were happy with them. They kind of hung out with them and whatnot. And so they had a very good relation with the Israelites. Fun connection to someone killing a leader of an enemy army instead of letting him live is Jael. And so Jael is the wife of Habor, the Kenite. And so now we have Saul rescuing the Kenites from not destroying them. I guess he kind of rescues them. He could have left them. But anyway, she did what he was supposed to do, chop off the leader, kill the leader with the tent peg, didn't hesitate, and Saul doesn't. And do you remember who the male leader was in that story with Jael? Yeah. And he was like a Saul character, honestly, because Deborah was the one who's like, let's go here. And then Barak finally starts doing his thing. But even then, she comes and says, hey, the guy you were supposed to eliminate, I got him in here. He's dead. And so there's that one, another throwback to Judges where you kind of least suspect it with this whole Kenite group right here that gets included. Like, oh, wait a second. We've seen them before. And oh, yeah, we're not saving Agags. In that case, we are killing the Agags. But now Saul is failing where she succeeded. So, Saul and his army, they roved around destroying Amalekites. Great, fantastic. That's how the battle ends. So, we get a famous survivor. Everybody knows this guy. Agag is left alive. Again, we've seen this more than... When was the last time the army swayed Saul's opinion? Saving Jonathan. So this is something, again, we've seen Saul, he defers to the army for good and bad because he's not an effective leader. He is not a good leader. And so if the army is doing something that is correct, good for Saul. If, in this case, I don't know how much they did or didn't think Agag should be left alive. He blames them anyway, but the text indicates they were for it because they take a bunch of stuff. And so now Saul is led away with his army. When it says what they took, they were not, all right, so it says, in verse 9, however, Saul and the army spared Agag with the best of the flock, the cattle, fatlings, whatever. They were not willing to slaughter them. But what did they slaughter? What was despised and worthless. Getting back to the kind of universal concept of we have morality inside of us, you can already see cracks in the faithfulness of the Israelites to God here, because what they valued was what they looked upon and saw that was good to take. What famous story does that remind you of? This is the Garden of Eden all over again. We looked upon it. You told us not to do that, but it looked good to us. Bloop, we take it, and now there are going to be problems. So Israel's judgment is going to come later, and they're going to get just as bad as this, if not worse. But you see signs of it right here at the very early on. Things judged worthless to them were disposed of, which then would also include all of those women, children, and infants. They said they were worthless. We don't want them. We want the stuff. We want their animals and livestock. And so you're thinking like, Israel, ooh, how far you've already fallen. They didn't just spare a few things either. Achan got in trouble for hoarding enough that he could cover it with his tent. That wasn't a lot. And he got in a big trouble for that. And it's understandable everything that happened there. They had all sorts of stuff. And I mean, there's a whole list. Pretty much the list of things they weren't supposed to take was like a list of things they're like, oh, we should go take those things. Like, oh, thanks, God. We weren't looking for those, but now that we know they're there, let's go get these people. Yes?
So why of all people would you leave the enemy king alive unless you were planning to have some sort of treaty with him later or some kind of tribute agreement or something?
So it may have been that because where the roaming, we don't know how many Amalekites may or may not be out there. And so they're probably, if they are out there, probably want a little revenge. And so, hey, we have your king. So kind of a ransom. Another aspect of it is they like taking the leaders, keeping them in court as trophies. We see that with some like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, with Israel's kings. We saw it with, I forget off the top of my head. There's a couple references that happen in Judges similar to that. They like showing off their prizes. And so Saul, he's just now kind of galvanized Israel behind him. And so not only does he have some great victories, now I also have these kings. We're so powerful now that I've got these kings in court that I've maimed, and they're essentially just my pets now. But look at that over there. And so that seems to be what's going on. I don't think Saul was really intending to kill Agag. I am convinced he probably would have killed some of the animals they took, but I don't think he'd have killed all of them either as sacrifice, as he claims he's going to do. And so, yeah.
It could also be like a psychological defeat of the king, where you're forcing him to watch his nation be annihilated and taking away, stripping him of his power, and then just making him suffer through that.
Yeah, because I don't know when he was taken or what he did or didn't see. Yeah, so there's a lot that could be going on there. So we get another strange phrase we haven't got to in the reading yet. Oh, one last thing before we get to that, and we'll probably end on this tonight, is in verse 4, you get some very, very big numbers. And the last time we heard about Saul's army size, do you guys remember how many men were in it?
3,000 in the first part of chapter.
How many did he end with?
600.
600. And so whatever those numbers are, they have exponentially grown the army, and it is no longer this little feeble, scared band hiding in the caves and whatnot. And so he is a long throw from that. He has a full, like 200,000, I don't know how big armies were back then. That's a lot of men. That is a lot. And so the little 600 band, those days are gone. We have a legitimate standing army in Israel now. And so with that one, we'll stop here before we get into the Samuel interactions, because I don't want to cut that in half right there. And again, it's a famous story, so we kind of know what's about to happen. But there's a little bit going on there I'd rather spend more time talking about. But we have a couple minutes. Does anybody have any more comments they want to throw in about the harem, the total destruction ban stuff? Yeah.
I was just going to say about the plundering. It's also a reversal of how God outlined sacrifices. You should be giving the best to God, and instead they keep the best for them.
Your best, yeah.
They give the worst to God.
Yeah. It's exactly what they did, because what they did dedicate to God was the stuff nobody wanted. Yeah. And the stuff that they didn't was the stuff everybody wanted. That's a great observation I did not make with this reading. Does anybody else have any final comments or thoughts they need to get out this evening? Yes?
Yeah, just, I do really understand the idea of questioning God's character, but it is also true that without God, we wouldn't understand anything about goodness, I don't think, what that is. I would also say that using people as object lessons is something that God, I think, always has done and still does. Like when Jesus encounters the blind man in, I think it's John 9, he says that, no one sinned in this. It's not because of his sin or his parents' sin, but this happened so that the work of God would be shown in his life. And I can look at that and say, well, that's not fair. That how could God use this man as an object lesson of blindness? But I think he does do that, and he uses us that way too. He can use our suffering as a way to teach people and teach us. And it is, if we have faith that what God does is good, then that's something that we have to come to terms with.
Yeah, it gets very much to the point of Habakkuk, and then the end of the book of Job, which, oversimplifying them, is essentially, you don't fully understand how I'm doing things. Have a humble heart to accept it, stay faithful to me, and it will be okay for you in the end. Because both Habakkuk and Job kind of have those same, what's going on here? He's nicer to Habakkuk about it, because Habakkuk seems to be a little more sincere. He's kind of brutal with Job, buddy, get in your place. You don't run this thing. I do. And the instances like that where I'm looking at it from my perspective, I may not get it, but from 30 million thousand feet, wherever he is up there, everything's a lot more clear, makes a whole lot more sense. But as I said, next time, we didn't get to it. We will talk about a character aspect of God that I feel like we don't talk about very much, which then we can circle back around to the beginning of this chapter, and it's like, oh wait, yeah, this kind of makes a lot more sense of what's going on right here. So yeah. So, anybody else have any final thoughts before we get out of here on the last bell? Great. Thank you for all your comments this evening. We will be in the auditorium on Sunday. Wally came and said he'll be out of town, so we'll be shifting to the auditorium on Sunday. So if you're here and no one's in here, just go out there, and that's where we will be. So have a great rest of your evening. Hopefully I'll see all you guys on Sunday.